Welcome to Bereans at the Gate. This is our video blog for February 21st, 2018. As always, there is much to talk about, so let's jump right into it. We probably should start with the shooting and the outbreak of shooting that we've seen sort of in recent years. If you look at trends, it looks like violent crime is actually trending down in the United States, but it appears that these kinds of mass shootings are trending up. And so I think that creates a lot of the political controversy surrounding this, and of course the horrible loss of human life, and so I don't want to reduce it just to a political issue. But I'm curious what our panel thinks about change as we see it maybe afoot after the Parkland shooting. So first of all, do you guys think that we're going to see actual legislative change take place because of what's happened in Florida? Mark, let's start with you.
I think there will be an effort on the part of Congress and on the part of state legislatures. Now, with Congress, I'm not so sure the effort will go very far. State legislatures will probably be more active, in my opinion, more aggressive, particularly, and of course, more liberal states. But I do think Congress will make an effort. At least they'll talk until things die off.
So just to be clear, you're predicting that Congress will talk about it. That's a very bold prediction on Dr. Claus's
They'll seriously talk about it.
It's a way to take a big risk. Put your neck way out there.
They'll seriously talk about it. They will talk about passing legislation, I think, even.
Okay.
They may even propose legislation, but it may never even come to a vote. That's my prediction, actually.
All right. Jeff, what do you think? You think we're going to see changes?
I think there's a possibility of some changes at the margin. As we were talking before this started filming, David French had a really good idea, I thought, as I understood it, to basically restrict people that are potentially a threat, like a gun restraining order, for those that have some sort of accusation of, they're a threat to society, such that the general population is not having their gun rights minimized, and yet you could potentially target those that, no pun intended, bad word choice. You could choose to affect only those that are particularly a threat, and yet it would be a temporary thing, i.e. you'd have to have some person that's well-connected, a family member that could testify to the need of this, and then it would be forever. They would have to say that it's a continuing thing to restrain that, and that potentially, because this young man apparently, pretty much everybody knew that this was a bomb that was going to go off
including
sometime.
the FBI.
Including the FBI, and that's another huge part of this case. So there could be things like that, and I think there will be some attempts and changes, small changes at the margin. Any big changes, I think you're still going to be at that fundamental loggerheads of those that are in favor of gun rights and those that are opposed.
Bert, do you see changes coming?
Well, I would hate to predict for this particular incident whether or not, but I do think that if we continue to have mass shootings, the function doesn't seem to be linear. They seem to be increasing, at least right now, that we will have to do something at some point in time. The problem that I have with what the government can do in terms of legislation is I don't think it'll be really effective. I agree that with Professor Heyman, he mentioned what David French had said, but this is an individual problem. This is partially at least a failure of us as individuals to be connected enough to each other to police one another.
Good point.
And it's indicative of some kind of a breakdown culturally and societally. And generally speaking, I don't think the government can do a lot to try to. Well, they can try, but to be effective.
Can't change human nature.
I mean, you could ban assault weapons, but already there are like 400 million weapons in the United States right now already. And anyone that really wanted to do this, I'm sure, could come up with a weapon. I mean, I think the idea is we may come down to a point where, and I think we're trending this way, to where we'll have more of us armed. And that may end up being somewhat of a deterrent in the future.
In schools, you mean?
Or
schools
other places, publicly.
Just around. Again, I would hate to give all, I would only want a very select group of teachers to have weapons. I mean, I can't see a lot of the high school teachers I have, we probably wouldn't want to be armed, I don't think. Overall gun violence is down. It's been falling for decades, even though the number of guns has doubled over the last several decades. Most of the deaths are from handguns. They're not from assault rifles. 2/3 are suicide, I think. So it's just that the impact of these horrific crimes is so, even though statistically it's a relatively small thing, and statistically things are looking better, it's just so horrific that if this continues, the government, I think at the federal level, in addition to state, is going to have to take something that will appear to be drastic action. There'll be more than the banning of bump stocks.
One of the arguments that you get, and I'm not making this argument, one of the common arguments is this is really a mental health issue. That sure, there's a policy issue as it relates to firearms, but our society has changed its attitude toward mental health.
So.
And so many of these shooters, if you look at their profiles, they have serious mental health problems.
Yeah.
And let's be indelicate about it, that 2 or 3 generations ago might have had them institutionalized.
Yes. And as of the
And so
70s, it wasn't.
Our trend is toward mainstreaming people with mental health problems, and I think there's a positive benefit of that, so don't misunderstand me. But to what degree is this just a question of recreating our mental health system, or at least more of a willingness to maybe even allow the government and others to intervene and to institutionalize? When none of these words sound fitting for the 21st century, but I don't know whether that's the direction we may be headed, is a more robust governmental effort when it comes to mental health.
A better angle of that, I think, might be for the people who are talking about this, is to improve mental health policy in general and not aim it specifically at gun issues.
Of course, that's right.
In a more general
You would have
fashion.
but the net effect would be to
It
maybe
would be
offset
in
some of this
cases.
as well. Right.
But then you always face the problem, and it's somewhat subjective for a physician or someone else to say this person is dangerous.
Right.
How do they draw that line? What are the criteria they use to draw that
Right.
line? Then you've institutionalized somebody or taken a right away from them
Yep.
in some way that shouldn't have happened, and that worries me. And there's
Well,
a tension
if
there.
you were to follow what French says, then the court would be involved, and you could get testimony from people that really knew this person. And hopefully, again, I know that it wouldn't work
Right.
out perfectly, but then you could have a judge listen to people that know the individual well, and they might not need to be institutionalized, or they might, but they certainly maybe shouldn't have access to weapons
15
sometimes.
Right. No, it's a possible improvement, yeah.
My problem with that, like temporary restraining orders, they only work as well as the person's willing to abide by it. I mean,
That's right.
Someone might have a temporary restraining order against being in the presence of another person. Well, they could violate
Okay.
that. It's not like there's some governmental watchdog around them all the time that enforces it. And so it may be better than nothing. It may have an effect. But you wonder whether it'd be enough of an effect to really deter someone who has a serious
That's right.
mental
Would
health
it be?
problem.
That's right.
I just don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
It's not
We never
clear,
know.
It's not clear to me that any of the proposed policies would actually have the intended effect of reducing it. When somebody
right.
wants to do these horrific things,
Yeah.
they seem to have the capacity to do so. So
Yeah, that's a problem.
It's the kind of problem there's not an easy solution for.
No.
If there were an easy solution,
We've
we'd
done it
already
a long
tackled
time
it,
ago.
right? I mean,
We've already
so
done
last thing about gun control, I'd at least like to mention, what about the argument that the National Rifle Association is really the problem here, that they're kind of behind the scenes, the puppet masters who are controlling enough members of Congress so that we will not see meaningful gun legislation because the NRA opposes it. You guys think that's a rational perspective, an irrational perspective? I mean, what do you think? Jeff, any thoughts?
I think that the NRA is a good barometer of the people that contribute to the NRA, and the
Yeah.
reason we won't have gun control is precisely because there's a large body of the population that does not want it. The NRA is simply representing their own set of constituency.
Or at least not significant gun control.
Not significant.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bert, any thoughts?
I agree. I think the arguments are specious at best.
Yeah. And the NRA as an interest group, I think is powerful, but I agree they're powerful because they have a huge membership. They reflect a significant point of view. And people like to assign sort of an all authority to interest groups, kind of like if they say jump, politicians say how high. I think the more natural connection is they look for politicians that agree with them and then donate to them and support them, and there's this mutual relationship that exists. And so I don't see it as corrupting necessarily. Maybe that makes me naive, but I don't know.
This is fodder for the conspiracy theory mill, right? Another conspiracy theory that we can talk about for years to come, right?
Yeah.
Like they're alien bodies in Area
So
51.
they're the
right?
new Freemasons, is that what
Yeah,
you're
the
saying?
new Freemasons, yeah. In a sense, it is. I agree with you all. They don't have the power that we think they do. They're reflective. They're not determinative.
Tell me about the rituals.
Yeah, the Freemasons, yeah. Well, I can't tell you.
Next.
All right. It's always interesting to make a transition from laughing about something, especially as it relates to Dr. Clausen. It's something a little bit more sober. Today we learned of the death of Billy Graham. I think definitely the father of evangelicalism in the United States in the 20th century. I think history will treat him as one of the most significant American religious figures, period, much less of the last 100 years. And so I'm curious for you all, we all grew up in a time where Graham was extremely influential. I'm curious for you all, especially for some of our viewers, they may not have a real strong understanding of Graham and his impact. And so I'd be interested to see, let's start with Mark. I mean, what's your When you think of Billy Graham, especially when you think of growing up and in
Yeah.
your particular subculture, what do you think of Graham and what kind of effect did he have on you and the people around you?
He was in my town, and he was passed within 4 feet of me at one of his crusades. So I remember him well. And what I remember about him most was he preached a consistent message every time. The gospel. It was simple, easy to understand, but powerful, because that is the gospel. And the other thing I remembered about him was, this is what other people said, not what he said, but the fact that he was meticulously moral in his personal life. Even as much as Mike Pence or more, for example.
Yeah.
He never went on elevators with women by himself and other things like this. And he had other people keep his finances, other organizations. He was meticulous about that. He didn't want to be seen as compromising his ministry in any way. I appreciated that. And he was a simple guy, in effect. He wasn't a flashy guy.
Right.
So,
Jeff, what about you?
Similar that the consistency of the message. I was always a little bit skeptical about the effectiveness long term of his altar calls.
Yeah.
I think it's, but even, I can remember he came to Northern Virginia in our church, and it was one of the many churches they had put out the clarion call to be able to disciple these people after the event. And I thought that was a good idea early on. Perhaps maybe they didn't have the long-term success, but nevertheless, the public persona, the unabashed, consistent delivery of the gospel in a way that was genuine and was received by most people, such that he was always in the list of the most admired Americans. And I thought that bode well for the Christian message.
yeah.
I have very fond memories of listening to Billy Graham when I was young. I have a specific memory of maybe 8 years old. He's Crusade on television. Again, I don't know. So let's see. This is probably, we'll say 66. So something around that time. So he's still young, relatively young guy. And I know that it had some effect on me. I wasn't converted at the time, but it helped me to understand a little bit. I agree when you said he was the father of evangelicalism, and during that time period, the phrase may have died out. I don't know, that may be hyperbole, but it certainly wouldn't be as strong as it was. Just the emphasis on the conversion experience relative to the entire walk was so much stronger under him, and in some sense, it's a kind of a gospel light, because it does put a lot of emphasis on repentance at that time, and then there's not quite as much of the follow-up that we see all over the New Testament.
That changed, though. That changed.
To a certain extent, I agree. I wouldn't disagree that it got better, but also his first crusade, sometime in the 40s, first big crusade in L.A., I've read about that. Yeah. God was all over him at that time. There was a lot going on. I don't know exactly why. He... despite being, as you said, the simple boy from North Carolina, was progressive for a Southerner when it came to civil rights issues.
Oh, yeah. No question.
He, I think, was one of the few people that was allowed to call Martin Luther King Mike. And he was very much ahead of his time in a way in some of those issues. I think his impact through his ministry to the presidents cannot be minimized either. He had a huge impact on the United States during this time. I read a couple of things about him before coming in here, and President Bush the Younger credits him with helping him come back to his faith in 2010. And then some of the stories he has about Nixon are just absolutely interesting, So we have lost today a gentleman that has had a large impact on global culture and on the culture of the United States particularly.
Yeah, I think
evangelicalism.
For our viewers, especially younger viewers who may be out there, can you conceive of a modern American culture where a pastor could command a stadium of 80 to 100,000 people that would be shown on network television, that would get broad coverage in the mainstream media in a way that it becomes a national sensation? It's hard to fathom anything remotely like that taking place in today's context for a lot of reasons. And I don't want to make them unique to Billy Graham. He would be the first to say it had nothing to do with him. It really has to do with Christ working through him. But it shows you how much our culture has changed when we can't even conceive of something like that happening today, which is remarkable, I think. Bert, I appreciate what you brought up about his public ministry. significant public ministry behind the scenes, public but behind the scenes still. He did retire from a little bit of that. The
Yeah.
Nixon administration burned him to some
Yeah.
extent. He's a little bit too close to Nixon, at least maybe in the public's eyes. And then Nixon, of course, resigns and is hounded out of office appropriately. And Graham suffered a little bit in public perception, I think, because of that. And then most of his ministry at that point, I think, becomes behind the scenes to presidents of the United States. But still, tremendous ministry. A massive loss. And when you think of evangelicalism moving forward, it's hard for me to see that there's anyone even remotely able to fill shoes quite like that.
Yeah.
So it is a bad day,
people.
a black day for evangelicals in that sense, but a banner day in the sense that Billy Graham is somewhere where we know he is, and he is celebrating in heaven, and it is a remarkable life, unquestionably.
Yep.
All right, well, I think that wraps it up for us. Thank you for joining us for this video blog. If you have questions, continue to send them our way, and we will talk to you later. Thank you.